When the alien war ended, humanity demanded justice. She was their prisoner, a widow from the enemy side, pale as ice and guilty by association. But instead of a cell, they gave her a sentence: live among the very humans she once fought against. No one expected the man assigned to her, a broken soldier who'd lost everything, to see beyond her blue skin. No one expected compassion to grow in a world still burning from war. Yet sometimes punishment becomes redemption. And sometimes the enemy becomes family. They called it reparation. The word had a bitter taste in Leora's mouth, sharp and metallic, like blood swallowed after a wound. The chamber was cold. The light above her was white, too white, cutting through her pale lavender skin until she almost glowed. Around her, the council murmured in tones that carried neither warmth nor pity. They weren't sentencing her to death. No, that would have been merciful. They were sentencing her to something worse, a life among the humans. Her fingers trembled slightly as she clasped them together, the silver cuffs around her wrists pulsing faintly with containment energy. She didn't resist. Resistance had been burned out of her the day her world burned. Leora of House Rinka, the voice of the presiding judge rang through the chamber, cold and practiced. By decree of the Intergalactic Concord, you have been selected as a candidate for cultural reparations. You will serve your sentence on Terra, under human supervision, for a term of no less than 5 planetary cycles. Leora's voice cracked when she finally spoke. You mean slavery? Murmurs spread across the room. The judge ignored them. Your presence will represent reconciliation. The humans have lost as much as we have. Perhaps both species might learn compassion from shared grief. Her head tilted slightly, the bioluminescent patterns on her cheeks flickering dimly, the Yethri version of a grimace. You call this compassion? The judge did not answer. The guards led her away. The ship that carried her to Terra was silent. She sat alone in a small transport cell with a viewport showing only black void and stars, endless, merciless stars. Somewhere in that void, her husband's ashes floated in what was once the Yethri fleet. Somewhere, her children grew up under the supervision of the same state that now exiled her. The humans, she'd been told, were simple, rough, primitive. They lived by soil and steel, not thought and grace. And yet, it was their world she was being sent to help rebuild the peace. Leora didn't believe in peace anymore. The descent burned across the sky like a falling star. Jacob Hale squinted against the morning light as he stood in the open fields, hands braced against the old wooden fence. The dry wind pulled at his hat brim, the smell of dust and rain mixing with the faint scent of oil from the tractor. He had seen that light before, years ago when the war was still young. The sky had glowed red then, and his wife Marion had stood beside him whispering, "Do you think they'll ever reach us out here?" He had said no. He'd been wrong. Now years later, when the war had ended and the world had gone quiet, the same light fell again, but not as a weapon. A transport. He'd been warned of it a week prior. A guest, they said. A cultural placement. He didn't want one. He didn't want anyone. The last person assigned to help him rebuild had left after 3 weeks, unable to stand the silence, the long stretches of sky and grief that hung around the ranch like fog. He had stopped talking much after Marion's death, stopped smiling altogether. When the ship's hatch opened, a faint hiss escaped as the ramp lowered into the red dirt. Out stepped a figure draped in a gray regulation robe. The being moved with hesitant grace, tall, slender, skin faintly luminescent under the sunlight, eyes the color of sea glass. Jacob had seen aliens before, but never this close. He expected something monstrous or cold, not someone who looked like she could break if you spoke too loud. She looked up at him. He looked back. For a long time, neither spoke. A man in uniform handed Jacob a datapad. You'll need to sign this, confirming receipt. She's under your care and supervision for the duration of her reparation period. Jacob's voice was rough when he finally spoke. I didn't ask for this. The officer gave a thin smile. No one did. But orders are orders. He turned to Leora. You are to follow local authority, contribute to agricultural production, and maintain peaceful conduct. Failure to comply will result in retrieval and reassignment. Leora didn't answer. She just stared past them, at the fields, the fences, the strange blue of the Earth's sky. When the officers left, silence filled the ranch again. Only the wind moved, curling dust around their feet. Jacob cleared his throat. You got a name? Her voice was soft, musical in a way that didn't belong to Earth. Leora. He nodded slowly. Well, Leora. I'm Jacob. Guess they sent you here to punish us both. The corner of her mouth twitched, the faintest ghost of something, not quite a smile. Seems so. Her quarters were small, a spare room in the old house. She inspected it with the quiet detachment of someone used to having no say. The bed was coarse, the walls plain, but the window overlooked a field that glowed gold in the sunset. For a moment, she stood there watching. On her homeworld, sunsets were violet and silver. This world's gold light felt heavy, too alive, too human. Outside, Jacob worked in silence. She observed him from the window, the way he moved, deliberate and slow, every motion heavy with memory. When he lifted the feed sacks or fixed the fence, there was precision, not strength, the precision of someone who had built everything alone and lost more than he could bear. She didn't understand humans, their attachment to soil, their habit of burying themselves in work instead of healing. But she recognized grief. That, at least, was universal. The first night passed in silence. The second, she ventured out. The wind was cool, carrying the scent of wet earth. Jacob sat on the porch, boots propped up, staring into the darkness like he expected something to appear. She stood by the steps, uncertain. "You do this every night?" He shrugged. "Used to sit out here with someone. Hard to stop habits." She hesitated. "Your mate?" He nodded once. "Wife. Died when the sky burned." Leora's throat tightened. "Mine too." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was shared. He glanced at her, eyes softening just enough to show a flicker of something human again. "Guess we both got ghosts, huh?" Leora looked at the stars. "On my world, we believe the dead become part of the constellations. Maybe they're up there now, hers and mine, arguing about whose turn it was to watch over us." Jacob chuckled, the sound rusty and used. "Wouldn't surprise me." For the first time in years, the ranch didn't feel empty. Just quiet. Over the next few days, they fell into rhythm, an awkward, wordless one, but rhythm all the same. Leora helped feed the animals, her long fingers surprisingly gentle with the calves. She learned how to drive the tractor, though the vibration made her skin shimmer with faint light. Jacob pretended not to notice. She cooked once, a strange dish that glowed faintly blue and tasted like seaweed and cinnamon. He ate it without complaint. She caught him sneaking seconds. At night, when he thought she was asleep, Jacob would sometimes whisper to the dark, old habits, talking to ghosts. And though she didn't understand all the words, Leora listened. Because sometimes listening was the first step back to being alive. When the fifth night came, a storm rolled over the plains, thunder cracking against the sky like the memory of war. Leora startled at the sound, pressing a hand to her chest as flashes of light painted her skin. Jacob found her in the hallway, trembling. "It's just a storm," he said quietly. Her voice shook. "Where I'm from, storms meant bombs." He didn't hesitate, just reached out, resting a calloused hand gently on her shoulder. "Not here. Here, it just means the sky's cleaning itself." She looked up at him, human, tired, kind in a way she hadn't expected. And for the first time since the sentence began, Leora thought that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't punishment after all. Life on Earth was nothing like the bright corridors of Iathar. There were no humming skylines, no silver bridges stretching across the horizon, no air that shimmered with controlled light. Here, everything breathed. The soil was dark and damp, the trees tall and crooked, the wind alive with the scent of something raw, smoke, rain, and memory. The night stretched forever, the stars unfiltered, jagged with distance. It felt as if someone had ripped open the sky just to remind her how small she was. For the first few weeks, Leora barely spoke. Jacob didn't seem to mind. He moved through his days like a clock wound too tightly. Up before dawn, coffee steaming in his rough hands, boots thudding against the wooden porch before the first hint of light touched the fields. He didn't ask for help. He didn't ask for company. He simply was. Leora tried to mirror that. She tended to the animals, cleaned the barn, and fixed what she could. It was strange. Her world's machines hummed with plasma cores and crystal circuitry, but the human ones had weight, smell, and heat. You could feel them resisting and giving in your hands. She liked that, even if she didn't admit it. Still, the silence between them was heavy. Two ghosts orbiting the same home, careful never to touch. At dinner, she sat across from him, quiet, the lamplight painting gold across her pale lavender skin. He ate without looking up, except for the occasional nod or grunt, the universal language of men who'd spent too long with their grief. Sometimes, she caught him staring when he thought she wasn't looking. Not with suspicion, but something else, curiosity perhaps, or confusion that she could exist at all. The last war had killed too many people for either of them to look at another species without remembering the smoke. One afternoon, the heat was brutal. The fields shimmered with haze, and even the crows had gone quiet. Jacob had been repairing the old water pump near the barn, a relic from before the war, but the handle kept seizing, the pipe gurgling air instead of water. Leora approached quietly, wiping sweat from her temples. "I can help," she said. Jacob looked up from under the brim of his hat, squinting. "You know pumps? I know machines." She knelt beside him, her long fingers tracing the shape of the pipe, feeling where it pulsed wrong. "You rely on pressure flow. Yethri use heat compression instead." He blinked. "English, please." Her lips twitched, that near smile again. "It's clogged." Together they worked, the silence shifting. Not gone, but alive now, carrying the rhythm of tools and shared breath. Jacob held the wrench, she adjusted the valve. When the water finally surged through with a violent hiss, it splashed over both of them, cold, shocking, real. Jacob cursed softly. Leora laughed, a sound light enough to make the birds scatter. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh. The sound stayed with him all evening. That night, the rain came again, soft at first, then harder, drumming on the tin roof. The air filled with the scent of wet earth and metal. Jacob sat at the kitchen table, oiling his tools. Across the room, Leora read one of Marion's old books. She couldn't understand every word, but the pictures fascinated her. Humans painted sorrow even in beauty. When she shifted, the faint blue glow of her skin reflected against the dark window. Jacob froze. His voice dropped to a whisper. "You're glowing." She looked up, startled. The glow dimmed immediately, fading like embers cooling in ash. It happens sometimes," she said quietly, curling her hands into her lap. "When we're tired. Or hungry." Jacob leaned forward. "It's not dangerous, is it?" Her brows lifted, surprised. "You're not afraid?" He shook his head slowly. "No. Just didn't expect it to be so damn beautiful." Her throat tightened. She looked away, blinking fast. It was the first time in months, maybe years, that anyone had looked at her with awe instead of disgust. Something changed after that night. The silence remained, but it softened, like a wound that no longer bled, only ached. They began to talk more. Small things at first. He taught her words: saddle, coffee, rainstorm. She corrected his clumsy attempts at pronouncing Yethri greetings, laughing when his accent twisted the meaning into something entirely new. In return, she told him fragments of her world, the floating gardens that moved with the tides of the twin moons, the songs her people sang to their young to calm their luminous hearts, the way the sky never truly went dark on Iathar. He listened more than he spoke, but sometimes, when the air was right, he'd tell her things too. Like how he met Marion, a small-town girl with eyes like trouble and a laugh that could silence thunder. Or how he stayed up every night during the war, staring at the sky, praying not for victory but for mercy. And one evening, when the stars were bright enough to touch, he said something she didn't expect. "I used to hate them, you know. You're kind." Leora didn't flinch. "You should." He shook his head. "Not anymore." The words hung there, raw, fragile. Neither of them tried to break them. Days blurred into weeks. Jacob found her humming while she worked, soft, haunting melodies that shimmered in the air like ripples of light. The animals grew calm around her. Even the stubborn old bull stopped kicking at the gate when she approached. He began leaving extra bread by her plate. She began fixing things he didn't ask her to. Sometimes, when he worked too long in the field, she'd bring him water, her footsteps almost silent in the dirt. And sometimes, when the night got too cold, she'd find a folded blanket left quietly by her door. Neither spoke of those small kindnesses. They didn't need to. But beneath all the quiet, something else began to grow, something neither of them could name. Not love, not yet. Something smaller, gentler. It lived in the way she watched him from the window while he worked. In the way he lingered just a little longer when she smiled. In the pauses between words, the ones that felt less like silence and more like breath. The war had taken everything from both of them, their homes, their families, their reasons to believe. But here, in the middle of nowhere, on a planet neither of them had chosen, they began to find the smallest pieces of themselves again. One night, as the crickets sang and the wind brushed through the open windows, Leora stood outside, looking up. The stars were sharper here, colder. But when she looked closely, she could almost see her home among them. Jacob joined her quietly. For a long time, they said nothing. Then he asked, "You ever think about going back?" She smiled sadly. "Every day. But I think maybe I'm not meant to go back. Not yet." He nodded slowly, eyes on the horizon. Yeah, I get that. The wind shifted, warm, carrying the smell of hay and rain. For the first time since she'd landed, Leora didn't feel exiled. She felt placed. Not punished. Not imprisoned. Just found. And for the first time in 2 broken lives, the silence between worlds began to sound a little like peace. The fields ripened under the strange sun, and the rhythm of the farm began to shape itself around their quiet coexistence. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months, soft, indistinguishable turns of the same weary wheel. Yet in those slow revolutions, something was shifting, almost imperceptibly, like soil loosening before the first green shoot. Jacob Hale had never been a man of words, even before the war took them from him. His wife, Mary, used to say that he spoke best through his hands, fixing fences, coaxing life from barren earth, making things grow where nothing should. Now those same hands worked beside a being whose skin shimmered when the light hit it right, like moonlight caught in water. Leora didn't speak much either. But where Jacob's silence was a wound, hers was armor. Each word she offered was weighed, measured, as though every syllable carried the weight of her fallen world. She repaired his tools without being asked, her slender fingers tracing the shape of broken things until they remembered how to work again. Jacob would watch her sometimes from the porch, the glow of dusk painting her in faint blue hues. Her movements were foreign, graceful yet deliberate, efficient in a way that felt both human and impossibly other. He never told her she was beautiful. He didn't have to. The thought hung between them like an unlit lantern. The war had taken everything from both of them, but in different ways. Jacob had lost his home first. The government took his land to build a forward base when the fighting began. He and Mary had been relocated further south, where the soil was dry and the nights colder. When the alien ships came, dropping fire and light, he lost her too. The farm had burned. His laughter, once loud enough to startle the chickens, had gone with it. Leora, on the other hand, had lost her dignity long before she lost her husband. The Yetheri called it the severing, when a soldier's family was stripped of honor upon their death. Her husband had died defending their fleet. The Empire had decided that his sacrifice was insufficient, his bloodline marked by shame. Her children were taken for retraining, her home confiscated. Then came the Council's decision: send widows like her to human colonies as living reparations. A symbolic offering, a humiliation dressed as peace. Jacob didn't know any of that at first. He didn't ask, and she didn't offer. But little pieces slipped out, like threads tugged loose from the edges of a tapestry. It started with the songs. He found her one morning humming softly, while tending to the crops. The melody was unlike anything he'd ever heard, neither sad nor happy but something in between. It wove through the air, low and haunting, and the corn leaves seemed to tremble in rhythm. When she noticed him standing there, she stopped abruptly. "I didn't mean to disturb you," she said in her halting English. "Didn't," Jacob replied simply. "The crops seemed to like it." A flicker of something crossed her face, amusement, maybe, or disbelief. "They listen," she said quietly. "Everything listens if you sing the right way." He didn't know what to make of that, but when he checked the field later that week, the crops had grown faster than they ever had before. The walls between them began to unravel not with grand gestures, but through the small, ordinary mercies of daily life. He showed her how to use the old water pump. She showed him how to mend machinery with resin extracted from local plants. They began to share their meals at the same table, still mostly silent, but no longer strangers to each other's company. One night, while sitting outside after a long day, he told her about Mary. How she'd died in the bombardment. How sometimes he still reached for her in the dark. Leora listened without interrupting, her bioluminescent eyes reflecting the stars. When he finished, she said softly, "My husband fell in the first wave. They told me he died a coward. But I saw the records. He shielded a transport ship. They lied because it was easier than honoring him." Jacob's hands tightened on his mug. "Guess both sides lied about a lot." "Yes," she said, almost to herself. "And we are what's left to carry it." For a long moment, they just sat there, two survivors bound by different wounds, staring into the endless dark. The storm came suddenly, the kind that rolls in from the plains with thunder like a promise. It started as a whisper, wind sliding through the cracks of the farmhouse, then built into a roar. Rain slammed against the windows, lightning carved the sky open, and from somewhere outside came a sound that made Jacob's heart stop, a low, deep boom, followed by the crackle of fire. "The barn," he gasped, already running for the door. He didn't look back to see if she followed, but she did. By the time they reached it, the west wall was already burning. The animals screamed inside. Jacob grabbed a hose, shouting over the wind, but the water sputtered weakly. The pump had gone down again. He didn't hesitate. He threw his jacket over his head and plunged into the smoke. Leora called after him, her voice breaking in the storm, then dove in as well. Inside was chaos, heat, panic, light. The fire danced up the beams like something alive. Jacob grabbed at ropes, herding the terrified cattle toward the open door. A beam cracked overhead and fell, and Leora's hand shot out, glowing blue, impossibly bright, and she caught it mid-fall, strength in her slight frame defying reason. He stared at her through the haze, this strange, luminous woman holding the weight of the world above him. "Go," she shouted. "Get out!" They stumbled into the rain together, coughing, soaked, trembling. The barn groaned behind them, half collapsed, but the animals were safe. For a moment neither spoke. Then Jacob turned to her, his eyes searching her face, soot-streaked, rain-drenched, skin still glowing faintly beneath the grime. "You weren't sent here to be punished," he said hoarsely. "Maybe, you were sent here to be found." The words hung between them, fragile, dangerous, true. Leora blinked, her eyes shimmering brighter for a moment before dimming again. She didn't answer, not in words. Instead, she reached out, hesitated, and then rested her hand lightly against his chest. Beneath her palm, his heart beat strong and steady. Beneath his hand, when he raised it to cover hers, her light pulsed once, soft, like the memory of dawn. That night, the storm passed. They sat together on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the remnants of lightning fade over the horizon. The farm smelled of smoke and wet earth. Neither knew what tomorrow would bring, whether peace could ever truly grow from the ashes of war. But for the first time in years, Jacob felt something take root inside him again. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But something that looked a lot like hope. And somewhere deep within her, in the hollow space where grief had lived too long, Leora felt a small warmth spreading, the first fragile spark of belonging on a world that was never meant to welcome her. The walls had begun to fall, and neither of them were ready for what that would mean. By the time spring came, the farm was alive again. The scorched barn had been rebuilt, smaller this time but stronger, with beams reinforced by strange, silver-hued resin that Leora had harvested from the local flora. Crops swayed tall under the touch of her songs, and Jacob's once empty fields had become a landscape of improbable color, gold wheat mixed with faintly blue flowers that glowed under moonlight. To anyone passing by, it might have looked like a miracle. To the capital, it looked like defiance. The council had rules. The Reparations Act was explicit. Yethri widows were to remain under human guardianship for no less than 3 Earth years, their labor monitored, their location reported monthly. They were symbols of peace, nothing more, not wives, not citizens, not equals. But word spread faster than rules could contain it. Travelers spoke of the human farmer and his alien companion, who rebuilt what war had broken. Some called it love. Others called it treason. And when rumors reached the capital that Jacob Hale, a man once honored for his service, had grown soft on his assigned reparation, the patrols came. It was early morning when they arrived. Jacob had been fixing the fence by the east field, the air sharp with dew. Leora was kneeling in the garden, her luminous hair tied back, hands buried in the soil. The sound of engines shattered the quiet, heavy, humming machines cutting across the plain. For armored transports. 6 soldiers in dark uniforms stepped out, their boots crunching against the dirt. The insignia on their sleeves marked them as Peace Enforcement Division, though the irony wasn't lost on either of them. The commanding officer, a tall man with gray eyes, scanned the property. "Jacob Hale." Jacob wiped his hands, standing tall. "That's me. You've been found in violation of Reparation Code 47A, harboring alien property beyond designated boundaries, failure to report interaction logs, and unsanctioned cohabitation." He said the words like a judge pronouncing sentence. Leora froze, her breath catching faintly. "She's not property," Jacob said, voice low. The officer ignored him and motioned to his men. "Take her. She's to be returned to the capital immediately. Her program is terminated." Jacob stepped in front of her before they could move. "You'll have to go through me." The soldiers raised their weapons, rifles humming with charge, blue light dancing along the barrels. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, sir. You're a veteran. You know how this goes." He did. He'd been on the other side of this before. But something inside him, something long dormant, had woken up since the day that glowing widow had walked off that ship. "She's done her time," he said. "You said this was about rehabilitation." About peace. His jaw clenched. But all you've done is build new cages. The officer's expression hardened. You think one man can redefine the terms of mercy? Jacob looked back at Leora, standing quietly behind him, eyes shining faintly in the light. Maybe I don't have to. Maybe she already did. The tension was a live thing, electric in the air. A single wrong move could have turned the field into a graveyard. Leora's voice broke the silence first, soft, measured, carrying a resonance that stilled the air itself. Enough. She stepped forward, ignoring the guns trained on her. Her bioluminescent markings pulsed slowly, rhythmically, like the heartbeat of the earth beneath them. I will not go, she said. Her voice carried across the field, not loud, but absolute. I have fulfilled my sentence. I have worked your soil, sung your crops alive, mended your broken machines. You took my husband, my children, my home. But you will not take my will. The officer raised a hand, signaling his men to advance. That was when the ground moved. It began as a whisper, a subtle vibration beneath their boots, then grew into a deep, resonant hum. The air shimmered faintly around her, blue light coursing through the cracks of the soil like veins of molten sapphire. Leora knelt and pressed her palm to the earth. I am Yetheri, she said, and the words came out like an invocation. Daughter of the Skyseed, mother of two, widow of the fallen. I am not property. The earth answered. The vibration turned into a rumble, the fields trembling as though the planet itself had drawn breath. The soldiers stumbled, guns wavering. The engines of their transports flickered and died. Jacob took an instinctive step back, shielding his eyes as light flared from the ground. Not fire, not lightning, but something older, something alive. It rippled outward in a wave that passed harmlessly through him, but struck the soldiers like a storm. When it faded, they stood pale and trembling, weapons lowered, eyes wide, as though something unseen had reached inside and forced them to remember what fear truly meant. The officer's voice shook when he spoke. What are you? Leora rose slowly, her expression unreadable. I am what your war tried to erase. For a long, suspended moment, no one moved. Then thunder cracked overhead, a deep, rolling sound that felt less like weather and more like judgment. Rain began to fall, slow, heavy drops that turned the dust to mud. The officer looked at Jacob, then at her. His jaw tightened, but his men were already retreating, shaken, unwilling to press further. He gave a curt nod, not of respect, but of surrender. Fine, he said quietly. You've made your choice. But don't expect the world to forgive it. Then they were gone, their transports vanishing into the distance, leaving behind the smell of ozone and rain. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Jacob turned to her, his hat dripping, his voice soft. You didn't have to do that. Yes, she said simply. I did. Her hands trembled faintly, the glow fading now, her strength spent. Jacob reached for her, catching her as she swayed. She didn't resist. They'll come back, he murmured. They'll send more. Then we'll be ready, she said, her head resting briefly against his shoulder. But they won't take me alive again. He didn't answer, only held her closer, the rain washing away the soot and the fear and everything else that had clung to them since the day she'd arrived. That night, lightning danced on the horizon again, far away, harmless this time. Inside the farmhouse, Leora sat by the window watching the sky. Jacob joined her, setting 2 mugs of coffee on the table. I used to think peace was something they signed on paper, he said quietly. Now I think maybe it's something you fight for, and never stop. She smiled faintly, her glow returning just enough to reflect in his eyes. Peace is not given, she said. It's planted, like a seed. It grows in places where people choose to stand. Outside, the fields shimmered faintly blue, her mark on the land, her quiet rebellion written in light. The world beyond might never understand what had happened there. The patrol would report what it could not explain, the capital would whisper of malfunctions, and the council would pretend not to fear the spark she had lit. But here, on a forgotten farm beneath a storm-torn sky, 2 survivors sat together. Not captor and captive, not alien and human, but something entirely new. And as the night deepened, their silence spoke what words could not. That mercy could be rewritten, and love, once forbidden, could become its own kind of revolution. The seasons turned quietly, like pages in a book no one had read in years. Spring melted into summer, and with it, the farm transformed. The fields were lush again, rows of golden wheat swaying beneath a sky so wide it could swallow sorrow whole. The air carried a hum that wasn't just wind or insects. It was life, stitched back together from silence and ash. Jacob often caught himself pausing mid-task just to listen, to the creak of the barn, the laughter of the wind, the faint hum of Leora's song drifting across the fields. She had begun singing again, not for the crops this time, but for the joy of hearing her own voice. It carried through the land like sunlight through dust. He had thought grief was a wall. Turns out, it had been a door all along, one he'd been too afraid to open until she walked through it. One morning, Jacob woke to a sound he hadn't heard in years. Laughter. Not human laughter, softer, melodic, threaded with tones that shimmered faintly in the air. He sat up, disoriented, the sound pulling him from the cocoon of half-sleep. He followed it out onto the porch. In the pasture, Leora stood surrounded by newborn calves. She was barefoot, her long, pale hair catching the light like silver thread. The calves followed her as she moved, their small hooves stumbling in clumsy rhythm. She sang something low and lilting, a lullaby from a world no human had ever known, and the animals responded as if under a spell. Jacob leaned against the post, smiling without realizing it. His heart ached in that gentle, unfamiliar way, the ache of healing, not loss. For the first time in years, the morning felt like a beginning. Later, they sat by the old fence, sharing coffee from chipped mugs. "You make it look easy," Jacob said, nodding toward the field. "Never seen animals listen to anyone like that." "It's not control," she replied. "It's harmony. My people learned long ago that life answers best when you don't shout at it." He chuckled. "Maybe humans could use a bit of that lesson." "Maybe," she said softly. "But you listen better than most." He looked at her then, really looked. The scars along her forearms, faint but still there. The tired lines near her eyes. And yet, there was light in her that no grief had managed to dim. For months, they'd worked side by side, eating in silence, laughing awkwardly, sharing small pieces of themselves. What began as necessity had turned into routine, and routine into something deeper. The kind of quiet companionship that didn't need to be named to be understood. That evening, the sky turned a color somewhere between gold and indigo, the kind of sky that felt like it was holding its breath. Leora approached him near the barn, her hands clasped around something small. "I have something for you," she said. Jacob raised an eyebrow. "What's this about?" She hesitated, then opened her palm. Resting there was a small, irregular crystal, glowing faintly from within. Not bright, just a steady, warm pulse like a living heart. "It's beautiful," he said quietly. "It's an HFY shard," she explained. "A piece of our memory stones. Each carries the essence of its bearer, thoughts, emotions, the songs of their spirit. We give them to those who heal us." He stared at it, unsure what to say. The light reflected in his rough, calloused hands, shimmering over scars from years of work and war. "Leora?" She smiled, and in her alien features there was something profoundly human. "You gave me safety when I had none. A place when I was lost. You reminded me that I was still someone." He felt the lump rise in his throat, that same stubborn weight he'd carried since the war, since burying his wife, since learning to survive instead of live. He turned the crystal over in his hand. "Guess we both got something precious out of this sentence," he said finally, voice thick with quiet emotion. She laughed, that soft, shimmering sound again. Perhaps punishment was never the point. As the weeks passed, the crystal became part of him. He kept it on the windowsill above the sink, where the morning sun would catch its glow. Sometimes it pulsed brighter when Leora sang, as if it remembered the melody. And the farm, once a place of grief and silence, now pulsed with life. Birds nested in the eaves of the barn. The crops grew thicker than they had in years. Even the neighbors who once whispered about the alien woman now stopped by for help or a cup of coffee, leaving a little less afraid each time. Human and HFY, two worlds that had once burned each other, were, in this forgotten corner of the planet, learning what it meant to rebuild. One night, as the first autumn frost painted the windows, Jacob found Leora sitting by the porch again, staring at the stars. "They look different from here," she said. "Stars?" She nodded. "Where I'm from, they sing to each other. But here they're quieter. Lonelier, maybe." He sat beside her, setting a blanket around her shoulders. "Maybe they're just waiting for someone to listen again." Her gaze shifted toward him, that strange, luminous depth in her eyes reflecting the universe above. "You think that's what we're doing?" He smiled faintly. "Listening?" "No," she said. "Healing." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of wheat and rain. Somewhere in the barn, the calves stirred, and the old wind chime clattered softly against the wall. For a long time, they sat without words. And somewhere between the silence and the stars, Jacob realized that peace wasn't the absence of pain, it was the presence of understanding. That love didn't replace what was lost. It grew beside it, like wildflowers reclaiming the ruins. By winter, the world beyond their farm had stopped asking questions. The war had become history, the reparation program, a quiet embarrassment no one wanted to speak of. But on that little patch of land, where one human and one alien widow had once been condemned to endure each other, something far greater had taken root. It wasn't just survival. It wasn't just forgiveness. It was belonging. The fields hummed softly with life, and inside the farmhouse, a single shard of alien light glowed steady through the cold. Two lost souls, bound by grief, remade by kindness, had built something that neither war, nor distance, nor difference could undo. And in the vast quiet of the universe, their story whispered like a prayer. That mercy can bloom in the ashes. And sometimes the greatest treasures are not found. They are healed into being.